Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on making sense of Microsoft 365 guests and external users featuring Microsoft MVP Thomas Vochten. My name is Vlad Catrinescu, and I'm Syskic's technical evangelist and a Microsoft MVP from Montreal, Canada. Now, I see a lot of familiar names in the attendees, and many of you might already know Syskic as a company, but for those of you who don't, let me briefly introduce you. Syskit is a Microsoft 365 software development company founded more than 14 years ago, and we are specializing on Microsoft 365 governance and security tools, and of course, tools for SharePoint admins. We currently have over 3,500 customers from around the world, ranging from small businesses to large corporations. And we have 4 different products, but our flagship is Syskit Point for Microsoft 365 governance. Now, before we get started, I'm sure all of you cannot wait for the presentation. A little bit of housekeeping. First of all, the question that we get the most often is, will we get the recording? And the answer is yes. So if you ever need to step up for an emergency, or you just want to share the amazing presentation with one of your colleagues after, you will have the link that you can share it to everybody afterwards. After the presentation by Thomas, we will have Carlo from Syskit come in, do a quick 5 to 10 minute demo on how Syskit Point can help you. And of course, at the end, we will have a Q&A session with Thomas. So please ask all of the questions you have. Thomas is amazing, very knowledgeable as well. So he will be able to answer all of your different questions. And I'm definitely not overselling him. Thomas is amazing. Now, talking about Thomas, it's my pleasure to introduce you to today's presenter, Thomas Vochten. Thomas is a technology evangelist helping companies implement Microsoft cloud technologies such as Microsoft 365. As a Microsoft MVP with over 20 years of experience in the IT industry, he has a deep knowledge of the Microsoft ecosystem and a passion for sharing it with others. Thomas travels the world to speak at events, conferences, and user groups to talk about technology and to make sure that people don't make the same mistakes as he did. He's also the president of the Belgian Information Worker User Group, the biggest Microsoft 365 focused user group in Belgium. So now I would like to give a warm welcome and turn things over to Thomas. Thomas, are you ready?
I think I'm ready. Yes.
Awesome.
If I push the right buttons, I think I'm indeed ready.
Well, I can say you sound good, you look good,
Yes.
I can see the slides, and whoever asked Thomas a very difficult question that he doesn't have an answer to, next time I'm in Belgium, I will pay you a drink of your choice, whether that is a
Uh,
coffee or a beer. So this way we get some tough questions for you, Thomas. I don't want you to get bored today, but
no
I'll let you
worries.
go on with the presentation.
No worries. Okay. Thank you, Vlad, for the introduction. So welcome everyone. I'm really excited to be here. It's a really nice time to learn about Microsoft 365 guests and external users. Now, that in itself is already a good question. What is the difference? What is a guest? What is an external user? Now, there isn't really a difference. I think some people call them guests, some people call them external users. Well, basically, when someone else that is not a part of your tenant wants to access resources in your tenant, we call it a guest. I usually call it a guest. Some people call it an external user. So in the next 45 minutes, these are the topics that I'm going to talk about. First of all, a little bit of setting the scene, I would say. What are these guests? What are these external users? Why do we need them? How does it work under the covers? First part. Then we're going to talk about managing those users. That seems relatively simple on the surface, but there's quite a few things that might not be as simple as you thought. So we're going to talk about management there. And of course, we'll also need to talk about security because In any tenant, you want a decent security policy, you want to play with conditional access policies, other security policies that you might have, and of course, we also want to enforce them for guests, not just for your normal users. So that's a very important topic also. And last but not least, it's a question I often get is, well, I know about external users and guests in Microsoft 365, and I've played around with them in Entra ID, but how do they relate to sharing links in OneDrive and SharePoint? Because we can also share information there and invite users to our tenant. How does that work or not work together? So that's the last thing I want to talk about today. So let's get started. Let's talk about external users in Microsoft 365. What are they? How does it work? And why would you want to have these users in your tenant? Well, obviously, because you want to share something. Now, the main concept here when it comes to guests and external users is the concept of bring your own ID. I mean, I've been around for quite some while. Vlad said something like 20 years. It's probably almost, well, 25 years at least. So I've seen different times. And in the past, I used to be a SharePoint administrator a long time ago. And when we wanted to grant external people access to our SharePoint environment, well, what we did is we went to our Active Directory or Azure Active Directory or Active Directory. We created a normal user for that user. We created a password and we sent that user and the password over to that external person. Well, you all know what the potential problems are there. You need to manage the username yourself. You need to manage the password. People forget the password. They maybe pass around the credentials. You don't have really good control. So that was all quite problematic. It worked. It still works if you want to do it that way. But this model that we have now is much more convenient, and it all evolves around the concept of bringing your own ID. It's the core concept. So you're not responsible for the identities of the people who are coming to your tenant, just for the access they have. And these identities, that external identities, can be user accounts in another Entra ID. They can be from social networks like Facebook or Google, although I don't see that very often in a business environment, but it's possible, or any other identity. If you've got a special identity provider, something custom that supports the usual standards, you can also use those in relation to Microsoft 365 guests. Even just an email address can be used as an external identity. That's also a very good solution if your guests are not coming from another Microsoft Entra ID tenant. But the key again is that you are not really responsible for the identities. You only manage the authorization, not the authentication or the identity itself. That is the key concept here. Now, it wouldn't be Microsoft if they wouldn't make some changes from well, now and then. There is a component or a product, you would say, in Entra ID called Entra ID External ID. It's a bit of a mouthful, I know. It's a bit, it's a bit strange, but Entra ID External ID. And again, it wouldn't be Microsoft if they sometimes would not introduce new concepts. So as of, I think, May 2024, so a month ago, 2 months ago, Entra ID External ID has been made generally available. That fact alone doesn't change much. Most of the concepts I'm going to talk about today already existed in the past, but there's 2 new terminologies that have emerged recently. First of all, the concept of a workforce tenant. That is something that you might have heard about, not heard about, and an external tenant. So a workforce tenant, or a workforce tenant configuration, as Microsoft calls it, is the tenant that contains your employee and organizational resources. So your regular, normal Microsoft 365 account that you use for your day-to-day work. So where your users are located. So that is a workforce tenant. You can also create a separate Microsoft Entra tenant in an external configuration, which basically means you have a separate identity, a separate directory where you manage your external users, which is not that common, but it is possible. When we're talking about Microsoft 365 and day-to-day collaboration with external people, you probably are going for the scenario on the left, which is the workforce tenant configuration. And which is also called B2B collaboration. So B2B collaboration is more or less the same thing. So if you're using Microsoft 365 and you want to share resources or files or anything or teams with the outside world, you're probably interested in the B2B collaboration scenario. But just know that there's also an external tenant configuration if you want to maybe share specific applications with external users through Entra ID. So that's also possible. But again, we are primarily interested in the B2B collaboration scenario, and that's also what I'm going to talk about and also demonstrate in a few minutes. So besides B2B collaboration, there is something else which is called B2B Direct Connect. It is relatively new, but the only functionality that is using B2B Direct Connect at this point, at least to my knowing, unless someone corrects me, is to support Teams shared channels. The interesting thing there is that Teams shared channels work with the two-way trust. So you mean you have your own tenant, which shares Teams resource, Teams channels, and you have an external tenant that where people have the possibility to access your channels in your Teams in that very specific Teams shared channel configuration. The difference there from an end user perspective is that the login to these resources is fully transparent. So it's totally different than B2B collaboration, which is the main focus of this talk. So in this case, there is a two-way trust, but in the B2B collaboration scenario, so again, this one that we're going to talk about today, there is a one-way trust relationship between your tenant, some people call it the resource tenant, and then the tenant where your external users reside. And I'm calling it tenant, but it might also be just an email address, some external identity provider. So, so again, when you share anything in Microsoft 365, you are probably using those B2B collaboration capabilities with that one-way trust. So that was to set the scene, the difference or the main architecture that we are going to talk about just now. So let's talk about managing guests and external users. I'm primarily going to use the demo. I'm going to use the portal, so the Entra ID portal. You could of course also use PowerShell, but I think it's not much use to see me type along some PowerShell commands to explain the concepts. Sometimes that is easier when you just use the portal. So that's what I'm going to do today. Managing these guest users, again, as I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, it looks quite simple. Actually, on the surface, it still seems very basic. You create a user, you invite a user, and the user accepts that invitation, and that's it. But there's actually a little bit more than meets the eye, and that's what we are going to talk about, and that's what I'm also going to demo in a few seconds. So again, Entra ID portal is your friend. There is also, of course, a Microsoft 365 admin portal where you can do some basic user management, especially for your internal users. But most of the time, and I think almost everyone just uses the Entra ID portal to do management of users, both internal users, but also external users. To be able to work with guests or invite these guests, because it works through an invitation process. It's called an invitation redemption process. I'm going back on that later. You need at least the guest inviter role. So of course, in my demos, as you usually do when you're doing a demo, I have a global admin role. That's easy. But if you're serious about security, I would say in the real world, you need at least a guest inviter role. When we invite guests to our tenant, that is done through an email. That is the basic or the built-in process. There is other possibilities, but usually when you invite people, it's usually through email. There are APIs available if you want to build something totally custom. That is all possible. It's not really the scope of this presentation today, but know that it is possible. But the default is an email that will be sent. So that being said, let's maybe just flip to the demo and look at how such an invitation and redemption process works. And with a little bit of luck, And I'm sure that Vlad will stop me if you don't see my screen, but you should
I
see my
your screen. You're all good, Thomas.
okay, my admin center. It's been a while since I used GoToWebinar, so I had a small disclaimer ready for if I would fail. So this is the Microsoft 365 admin center. Again, you could add a user here. You could also work with external users if you want. There's a special place here for guest users, but it's not really what I want to use. I usually, and I will disclose this immediately, I usually go for the Entra ID admin center. Now, before we get any comments, yes, I know you shouldn't call your break glass account break glass. I know that, but in this case, it's called break glass. So this is an overview of all my users. So both internal users and external users. As you can see, there's not much going on. So what we will do is we will invite a user. So invite external user, and then you can provide, don't worry about this, this is a browser extension. So then you can invite someone. Let's invite someone from another tenant. This is another Thomas in another tenant, and then you're able to provide some additional properties, the obvious ones like display name, etc. You can choose to send an invitation message or not. That has some interesting repercussions that I'll come back to. And then there is various other properties that you might be tempted to just next finish your way and just send the invitation. But I would advise you to at least look at a few of them. Some of them are very, very interesting. The first one is user type. By default, if you create a guest, it will be set to guest, but there is also a possibility to set it to member. Now, the user type is a bit of a special case. You can use the user type later on, primarily, if you're talking about securing things with conditional access, for example. If there is maybe people from a different tenant that you want to invite and they belong to the same organization, or it's a partner that you have a very close relationship with, you might also want to give those people member label. And based on that label, member or guest, you are able to base your security decisions on in conditional access. But usually, in general, if it's a guest user, you just want to set it to guest. But later on, when we talked about conditional access, you will see that we could also base our decisions based on this label and do different things for members than for guests. But in this case, this is just a guest, so we'll set it to guests. Something else when it comes to life cycle of your guests, it is interesting to set a manager or a sponsor, especially if you want to do some auditing or you want to make sure that no stale guest users are left behind, and you can build a process around this to make sure they are deleted afterwards. And then it's really handy to have a sponsor that you can assign to a guest user so they will be notified or have to agree or something like that. So that is also possible. I'm not really going to do that now. It's a little bit outside of the scope of this presentation, but know that you can do that here, and it's already tied to the external user object. Okay, there's various other properties. You can also, when inviting a member, make them a member of a specific role. So you can even grant them global admin role if you want. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that, but just know that it's possible. So all the different roles you have here, you can already assign them to guest users. Might be handy if a consultant works for your tenant that does some admin stuff like that. And in the end, you can just review what you've typed and then invite the user. There is also an invite redirect URL. I would advise you in most scenarios to just leave it like that. If you've got very specific applications that you're inviting users for, you might want to change this, but for most common scenarios, it's advised to just leave it like this. So all I did was give an email address. At this point, my Entra ID does not know what kind of user this is. So it does not know if it's coming from another Entra ID tenant. It might be Google, might be Facebook, something else. So it's not really aware of the identity. So let's invite the user. I didn't assign it any additional privileges. And then after a few seconds, if you refresh the page, before you accept the invitation or before the external user accepts the invitation, so I refresh a few times. Let's look at that user object as it is created. Of course, and obviously, if you've worked with Microsoft 365 before and you invited external users or you saw any external users, you know about this very specific syntax for the user principal name. So it's always constructed like this. It is the part of the email address, ext, and then your tenant domain. That's probably not really new for anyone. Of course, the user type is guest. And at this point, because we haven't accepted the invitation yet, the identity is supposed to come from your own tenant. And we will see after we accept the invitation in that other tenant that this will change. And we'll come back to this screen later on. Now, let's switch to the mailbox of that specific user. I've got that open here. And in the meantime, the invitation has been received. This is the default invitation that gets sent. If you've got any branding in your tenant, you're able to make this a little bit nicer looking, but this is the default one that you get. So I'm logged in with an external user in their tenant, and then you can accept the invitation. Let's see what happens then. First thing you see is this one, the permissions requested by. And I know we're all in IT, we're all tempted to just say, yeah, accept and go further. But it's quite interesting to see what is on this screen actually. For example, when it comes to the branding. So the branding we see here, those colors and that logo, that is the resource tenant. So it's already obvious that we are invited to this tenant. So that is important. But your own identity is already displayed here. But here it is made clear that you are invited to this company. In this case, it's just my name and this tenant. And it will tell you which kind of permissions that you will be sharing with the other site. Okay, let's accept and see what happens. Oh, more information required. If you get this prompt, you probably know what that means. That means that you need multi-factor authentication and you need to register multi-factor authentication. There is various configuration options possible. This tenant is set to the default. So that means that if you enforce multi-factor authentication for your guests, and that's what I've done in my tenant. I've enforced it for all users and all guests because that's what you should do. Then you get this prompt even as an external user. So what we need to do now is we need to register this in our Authenticator app as an external user. So I will click next. But of course, it's not the first webinar or session that I do. So I won't click next here when everyone can see my screen. So bear with me while I'll move this a little bit out of focus. And then I open my Authenticator app on my phone.
I have my Authenticator app ready, Thomas. As soon as I
I know.
I had it ready.
I know. I knew that was going to happen. So I'm scanning the QR code with my phone that I get presented here. I've done this before, you know. I've been around. So I'm scanning the QR code. You can't see that, but believe me, I'm doing that. And let me put this back. All right. I've registered, I have a test prompt, 75, I accept it on my phone, and then I have access, well, that was okay, and then I've got access to the tenant. So the Authenticator app is registered. Okay, need to do that again. That sometimes happens. I approve the sign-in request. And then something else happens. There is a terms of use. This is optional. This is something I've configured through conditional access. Just to show you that you just don't have to go with the defaults. There's various other things you can configure to make that sign-up experience a bit more custom. In this case, if I just click accept, that's not okay. I need to actually read the terms and conditions. So you need to expand this. This works through a PDF that you can upload to the Entra ID portal. In this case, I just asked Copilot to come up with a terms of use for guest users. I hope it's decent, but let's assume it's decent. So you upload a PDF somewhere, and then your guest users get this. They need to read it and then accept. Again, this is an optional step. And after that, yes, I'm trusting this. And after that, finally, we are granted access to the resource tenant. You can see on the left-hand side of the screen, this is the resource tenant. Now, we're not sharing anything here. That's also not really the aim of the demo, but that is something you can do here. By the way, if you, like me, you're a consultant and you are a member of 35 different tenants from 35 different companies and customers, you know what happens in your Authenticator app. You've got maybe 35 different registrations, and you're also a member of many, many tenants. There is a possibility to leave a tenant yourself, by the way. So that's also something that some people don't know. So if you click on organizations here and you go to manage organizations, there is a possibility, yes, there is a possibility to leave an external organization if that external organization enables it, because it's something that you can switch off so people can't leave your tenant. So just as a small extra tip that you know that is possible. But I don't want to leave yet. I just want to see what happens. So, okay, I'm invited to the tenant. That all seems to work. I didn't really share any resources, but that's not really important now. Let's go back to the Entra IDs admin center. I'm back in the resource tenants. Let's refresh the page, and you can see, or you might see, that some things have changed here. Mainly this one, identities has switched to external Azure AD. And I know it's not Azure AD anymore, it's Entra ID, but in many places in the interface, it's still called Azure AD. And this label here means that this external guest identity is coming from another Azure AD or Entra ID. So that has changed now. There's a few other things on the screen that are interesting. Of course, you can reset the redemption status. You can resend the email if you want, stuff like that. That is all possible. And there is also a possibility now, and that's relatively recent, to convert an external user to an internal user. This is something new. So when do you want to do this? Let's say you've got someone who is working for you from time to time. They're a guest user. They're logging in with their own identity to your tenant. But after a while, you say, well, this person is really great. We want to hire them. But then what happens then? Are you going to disable that account? Are you giving a new account? Probably they already have permissions to various resources in your tenant. By using this process and converting external users to internal users, you will give them a real internal identity, but they will retain all their permissions, and that's cool. So if they're a member of a team, if they have a OneDrive, stuff like that, that all continues to work. Of course, because you're actually converting, you're not just really changing that identity. You need a new user principal name in the real domain. You need to have a password that you can generate and send them, etc., etc. So that is also possible now. You might have missed that. So that's quite interesting. So that's how the basic redemption process works. If we go back to our user list and we refresh, we will see that this other Thomas could have given him a different display name maybe, is now a guest from an external Azure AD in our tenant, and it was based on an invitation. That is what we actually wanted. So that's the basic invitation and redemption process. Let's quickly go back to the slides to see, oops, if that works, my clicking skills, yes. Let's quickly go back to the slides to see what else we need to know there. We talked about a few different external user properties. We talked about the user principal name with the ext inside. We talked about the identities. We talked about your external Azure AD, but there are, of course, different possibilities, different other identity providers that are supported. A personal account or a Microsoft account, or however you want to call it, is also supported. Google, Facebook, an email address is supported. And if you've got something special, a special identity provider, that is also supported for more advanced scenarios. I must say, in the vast majority of cases of customers that I see who work with external users, and almost everyone does, almost everyone is using or external Azure AD and probably email through a one-time password. Those are the most common ones that I see everywhere. Something else that we also maybe need to touch upon, and there is, like I talked about user type, about guests and members. There is sometimes a bit of confusing terminology also in the documentation, actually. although they have a good page that explains this all. But still, there is different kinds of configurations available. What we've talked about until now were external guests and external members. Remember that user type, but you can also have internal guests and internal members. Internal guests, that's that old school scenario that I touched upon in the beginning. So you just create normal user accounts for your guests and passwords and send them over. And internal members are your normal employees. So sometimes you see these different terms used in the documentation. It's not really clear. So that's the difference between all those different types. And again, based on member and guest, you can base some decisions later on. When it comes to configuration, also there with the Entra ID, external ID, there's a few things that have changed over the years. You might recognize this screen. It's been around for, I would say, many years already. It's the collaboration settings screen. And this screen is mainly valid, or the settings in this screen are mainly valid for external users who are not coming from another Entra ID tenant. So if you're inviting someone over email or from Facebook or Google or another identity provider, these are the settings that you should look at. There's various interesting settings. Again, what you see on the screenshot is not necessarily the best practice. That's again a small disclaimer. This is just a screenshot, so it's not necessarily what you should do. But you can define a few different things here. For example, what can guests see in your tenant? Can they see the list of users? Not recommended, I would say. Can they at least see their own properties? Yes or no? That is all configurable here. Also, who can invite guest users to your tenant? That can also be configured here. We talked about enabling guest users to leave your tenant if they want that. That is also something you can configure here, and various other settings. This has been around again for many years. If you want to manage the settings for your guests who are coming from a different tenant, then you need to go to the cross-tenant access settings, which is another settings screen. It's a bit confusing in the beginning, and this screen has also already changed a few times over the years, so sometimes it's a bit confusing again, but this is probably the screen that you want to be if you want to work with people from another from another Entra ID tenant. Let's just look at these settings to see if there is anything interesting to us there. So we were previously in the users portion of the Entra ID portal. If you want to go to the settings for guest users or external users specifically, you have to go down a little bit, and then there's this special, I don't know what it's called, call out external identities. And there's quite a few different interesting settings here. We are primarily interested in this demo in the cross-tenant access settings, because it's a little bit, it's maybe a little bit confusing in the beginning. So what you can see here, and we are currently looking at the default settings, that means those settings are valid for every organization, every guest user in our tenant, but you can also set specific settings for specific partner organizations or customer organizations that some of your users are coming from, to give them different permissions, if that is, or different settings. That is possible here. It is divided into a few areas. You've got inbound and outbound settings. Inbound settings controls everything that is related to external users coming to your tenant and what they can do in your tenant. And outbound access is, of course, the other way around. What can my users do in someone else's tenant? You could probably, for example, just disable your own users being able to be a guest in an external identity, for example, an external directory, for example. That could be possible here. Let's look at the inbound details to see what we can do there. Of course, this is where you can enable or block access to your tenant as an external for external users. There is also the possibility to only allow access to certain applications. You can also change and enable or disable the different identity providers. Again, these are the default settings, so this is for everyone. So if you don't want to have SAML or WSFET identity providers for those custom systems, you can disable that here. If you don't want to enable the Microsoft account, you can enable or disable that here, but that's something you can do here. Another important tab, and we briefly talked about it when I invited my first external user, is the trust settings. So by default, when it comes to multi-factor authentication, when you force multi-factor authentication in your tenant, also for guest users, every guest user will be forced to register a new multi-factor authentication entry in their Authenticator app, because you want to make sure that they use multi-factor authentication. That is the default, and it's a very good default. Now, sometimes I get questions from customers, okay, there is this one specific tenant that we are working with a lot. Maybe it's also part of the same group of companies, or you really know what they're doing. Then it's possible to check this checkbox here, trust multi-factor authentication from Microsoft Entra tenants. So that means that if you enforce multi-factor authentication for guests, by checking this checkbox, they can use their own multi-factor authentication. So they log into their tenant as they would normally do. They have multi-factor authentication enabled. And when they have done so, that is trusted, or that flag, I could say, is trusted by your tenant. So when they're coming to your tenant and you're also enforcing multi-factor authentication, that connection will be trusted, and they say, okay, but they're already logged in with MFA. We will enable that connection. You could do this for, I would not necessarily do it here because it's really a high trust setting, because you're never sure, of course, who you're talking to. If you're, again, working together with some very specific partners or customers that you know that are aware of their security posture, you could maybe enable this for those specific customers. But I would never check this by default. So be very careful. You could also go a little bit further even. You could also trust their compliant devices. So you might imagine a situation where you only want people to access a certain resource, a website or your OneDrive or whatever, and they can only access it from a compliant device. When you check this checkbox, also the compliant device status from another tenant is taken into account here. Again, I would not necessarily recommend that to do that here in the default settings, but again, if you've got a very specific situation for a very specific partner or organization you're working with, then you can maybe do this. You can also check both if you want, but that's a bit specific. So let's maybe do that. So I haven't enabled that here. So let's go to organizational settings, and then you are able to choose a very specific tenant that you want to have a different configuration with. So let's add an organization here, and then very handy, you can provide the domain name or the tenant from a partner organization that you're working with. In this case, I've got demo tenants that I can use. It recognizes that the company is called Contoso. That's a tenant ID. Okay, we add it. By default, it will inherit all the default settings. So everything that we defined here in default will apply here. But let's say I really trust the people from Contoso. I know they're on par with their security, and I want to give them a little bit more trusted connection to my tenant. Then you can go to Contoso and change that default. There's a few other things you can change here, but you could say, okay, people from Contoso, we will trust their multi-factor authentication registration. So if you're working for Contoso and you want to work with my tenant, access resources here, and you're already using MFA, then I won't prompt you for an additional MFA registration in the Authenticator. But again, this is a high trust setting. Be very careful. Don't just enable the default. That is not what you want. So this is what I've done now. So people from Contoso have a differently configured inbound access from the other tenants. There's various other configurations here. You can also change the different identity providers that are being used. There is also maybe a little bit more advanced scenarios here. with self-service and user flows. So if you are looking for a very specific workflow or a very specific flow for users to sign up to your tenant, maybe with some a manager that needs to approve something, you can do that here. But that really depends on your situation and also on your subscription. But for regular Microsoft 365 sharing of information, you will probably not use these user flows here. So that is the cross-tenant access settings. I just wanted to show you one additional thing, and that is the one-time password, which is one of those identity providers. So until now, I've invited one user, which is coming from an external user provider, an external identity provider, where we can also invite an external user who is not coming from another Entra ID tenant. So I've got a fake email address here. Well, it's not really fake, it's a redirect to my own email address. So this is totally not coming from Entra ID. I can invite them, and then I will hopefully on my phone get an invitation. Let's see, just a second. So I invited a user that is not a part of an Entra ID tenant. Let's refresh, let's see when it arrives. Bear with me. In the meantime, I'm going to open an in private window just to make sure that this all will work. Of course, when you're doing a demo, it takes a little bit longer for that email to arrive. Here it is. So I received an email invitation on that special email address. I've copied the accept invitation, and then I will be signing in here. Of course, you need to sign in with the user that has been invited. Let me copy that again. This is my email address. But now, and when I click next, you will see, because it's just an email address, it has no way to verify who I actually am. So what happens now is that there is a code being sent, which will effectively be working like almost a password, which is also arriving in my email now. We just send the code to this email address, which is not an Entra ID email address. Okay, this is the code that I just copied from my mailbox. I'm signing in. And then it works more or less like another external user. So it's the same screen as we saw before with that other Entra ID user. We can accept. And then again, I'm not going to do this again, but we again need to validate or register multi-factor authentication for this account. But in the next time you want to log into this account, again, you need to do the same validation dance. So you will receive a code, and then you can go back to this screen and log in. So it also works for users who are not coming from an Entra ID tenant or another social identity provider. I really like this option, and it has been enabled by default on all tenants normally, unless you have changed something. So this is really worthwhile and works really well. So it's one of the best things you can have as a fallback scenario. So I highly encourage you to also look at this. In the few minutes that we have left, we need to talk, of course, about security and how to secure access to your tenant for guest users. And one of the main things, obviously, is conditional access. When it comes to conditional access, there is a few less possibilities than with your internal users. So what you see on the screen here, this is the limited list of grant controls that you can use for your external users. So you can do things like, of course, block access or require MFA. We noticed the compliant device, the terms of use, I showed you that. So that is possible, but this is everything you can do and not more. So it's a little bit more limited to your internal users. When it comes to session controls, it's also a little bit less of functionality. There's a few things here in session controls that you cannot do with B2B collaboration. Guest users, for example, require a password change. That is not possible, which is something that is possible with your internal users. So that is, that's what we can do here. A few examples of things I regularly see people implement when it comes to conditional access and guests. One of them is the terms of use. I've showed you the end result, how it looks like from a user perspective. How this works is you can go to your conditional access settings, you can upload a PDF, and you can select a language. I just selected English, but you can have different versions for the terms of use for different languages. Upload that, check a few checkboxes if they need to read the whole terms of use, yes or no, if the consent expires, etc. If you change the terms of use, do people need to agree to it again? Stuff like that. That can also be configured here. Many organizations use this. I think it's kind of a best practice, so you at least have something to show them when they would register for your tenant. I think it's really a good practice. Something else that I often see and that I also have implemented quite a few times when it comes to external users is web-only access. That is also quite interesting. So there is a possibility in conditional access to allow guest users, but then force them to only use web access. For example, if people are sharing information from SharePoint on OneDrive, by using this setting in conditional access, you're able to override whatever people would configure in SharePoint or in those sharing links to just give them access through a web browser and not through the real FAT client. That is also something that is very common in conditional access when it comes to external users. We already touched upon MFA, and I showed you this screen during the demo. So of course, obviously, it is a good idea to also have guest users use MFA. Everyone should use MFA. So this is something you should actually look at. Only check this checkbox if you're working with an identified other partner tenant, not just do that in the default settings, as I already mentioned. And when it comes to MFA, there's of course different authentication methods. And that's also a bit different in a guest situation. And this screenshot is coming from the Microsoft documentation. So depending on the scenario you use, so although you can ask guests to register MFA in your tenant, it's actually a good idea to let them do it in their tenant because that offers more capability. So depending on the scenario, so if you want to have those phishing resistant options like a FIDO security key, if you have an authentication context in Entra ID that requires that, something like that, well, then you have to look at this table to see, okay, what kind of possibilities there are. So this is something that you might need to look at. For example, again, those security keys or Windows Hello for Business, if you require that, or certificate-based authentication, people will have to do that in their home tenant because you cannot configure it for guest users in your resource tenant. I know it contradicts a little bit to the high trust scenario, but again, depends on the situation. If you really require this, these are your only options, I'm afraid. So I hope Microsoft will still change that afterwards because there's a few things on this screen that I'm not really happy with, but it is what it is. And last but not least, and then I think my 45 minutes are over, is the sharing links in OneDrive and SharePoint, because that is the most common point where your users will come across these guests when they want to share something, a team or a file or something else in their SharePoint and in OneDrive. So let's see. This is the screen that you might know from the SharePoint Admin Center. Again, small disclaimer, this is not necessarily a best practice what you see here. In many cases, I wouldn't set it to most permissive, but in this case, it is what it is. But many of these capabilities, specifically for SharePoint and OneDrive, can be configured from this screen. There's a few options here that you can set. Some of them can be overridden by conditional access and by the cross-tenant access settings that we talked about. So for example, if you don't want people to just share or just not invite guests from another tenant, you can set it to new and existing guests, so they need to invite them through Entra ID first. But that is not really the problem here. The problem is that by default, if you want to share through a sharing link in SharePoint and OneDrive, that it does not use Entra ID by default. So if you share something in your OneDrive, an invitation gets sent out, and that access works through the sharing link itself. It is a totally different mechanism that is used, and it's not using Entra ID as I just showed you in the last minutes. To enable that integration, and I usually recommend to do that, but there's always good reasons. It depends. I'm a consultant. There is a possibility through PowerShell to enable that integration, and for many of my customers, this is actually the best thing to do, and that will make sure that if you invite someone in OneDrive, Teams, or SharePoint to invite them to access a certain part of information, there will also be a guest user created in Entra ID automatically and transparently. I think that is a good situation also from a governance perspective. So you actually know which external users are capable of accessing that information in your tenant. It is also possible through the audit logs in another way, but I would absolutely at least have a look at this setting to see if that is something you want to configure in your tenant. And with that, I think I'm more or less out of time, so perfect. Let's have some takeaways. First of all, B2B collaboration. Those are the settings that you're probably after. So if you're browsing through documentation and you want to do anything with Microsoft 365 guest users, look for B2B collaboration. That is probably the thing you're after. Look at the different authentication options, the login providers. You're probably interested in Entra ID and the one-time passwords configuration, maybe also the other ones, depending on your scenario. Have a look at those cross-tenant access settings, the inbound, the outbound, maybe those trust settings, maybe set exceptions for specific partner organizations. Of course, force multi-factor authentications for everyone, also for your guests. Apply conditional access settings, maybe do web-only access or terms of use, stuff like that, and have a look at those sharing links because they don't use Entra external ID by default, but it can be changed. And with that, that was everything I wanted to say to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Thomas, for the awesome presentation. Okay, everyone, again, if you have any question for Thomas, I know some of you already started in the Q&A, so if you have any questions, please put them there, and we'll give Thomas a few minutes to take a break after talking and doing an amazing 45-minute presentation. And now I'll switch it over to Carlo, that has a huge smile on his face because Croatia just scored 2 goals in basically 2 minutes, and the game's almost over. So knock on wood that Croatia will win, but I'll let Happy Carlo take it over for a short demo of Siskit Point.
Thanks, Vlad. Thanks, Vlad. So for those who are new here, just a brief intro to Siskit Point. So Siskit Point is a governance, visibility, and security solution for your M365 environment. And today we will just focus on the external collaboration, and we will divide it into 2 parts. First part will be the visibility part, so the reactive side, and the second part will be the governance, the proactive side of external collaboration. So let's start with our dashboard where we have the dedicated tile for the external collaboration, which shows you the external users and sites with external sharing. And here we can click just on the number 21, and we can see more details about our external users, such as the last login. We can sort it by that, and also the external user type, which can be guest user, ad hoc user, or a shared channel user. Here we can dive even deeper to an individual guest user. For example, here Frane, where we can see all his analytics and usage over the environment in the last 30 days, his membership, and also access to the tenant. If we explore the access, we can see all his access and type, how it's giving through, and we can also manage directly here from the reporting section by just clicking on the shared file and remove access or edit those permissions. Now, on other view, we can go also back to the reporting section. As you can see, we have a lot of reports here, but let's focus just on the external sharing and the external users. Similar to the previous view, we can see just more details. So we can see for each individual guest user where he has access. We can also see the domain from which he is coming, so we can filter them by that. And we can see also the last login. Here, we can just select few guest users. In this case, we can go with Frane again, and we can see his activity. So this accesses the audit logs, and we can see all the activity that was performed by Frane and also performed by other members of the tenant to give membership or access to Frane. Difference here is that Siskit Point application is not limited by the 180 days like M365. We can store the audit logs for a year or more if needed. And also, based on these audit logs, we can also create alerts that can send a notification based on any activity that you deem to need to be informed of. Now that we saw the visibility part, let's move to the proactive and governance part of Siskit Point. For that, I'll go to the governance and policies, and here we have two policies that can tackle guest user access. So first policy is the inactive guest users. This policy is basically triggered whenever Siskit Point detects inactive guest user for more than 20 days. It will send a task to the manager of the guest user or any fallback option, and he will need to evaluate that guest user if he needs to have access or he doesn't. Additionally, we also have a fallback option where Siskit Point can automatically either disable or delete that guest user if the task is not completed by the users above. Second policy that we have is the access review. So access review policy is basically a policy which you create and send to the end users to review their workspace environment. So owners will receive a task from you to just reevaluate their environment. This policy can be repeated on a quarterly, yearly basis, whatever you deem is necessary. And you can also choose what your users need to focus on. So they can focus on the membership content, or they can just focus on the guest access and shared content externally. So this policy can be applied to all your resources, but you can also focus on certain resources by using our rules engine. So our rules engine can have conditions like number of guest users or sensitivity label or any metadata that you use in your environment, and it can just trigger on those workspaces that you deem are necessary to review. From the end user's perspective, it's pretty simple. So they will receive a wizard-like experience. So when they go to the application, they will just start this wizard type, and they will just go through the membership, see the guest users. They can make actions here. They can go to the sharing tab. They can see all the externally shared content, and they can remove those links right here immediately, and you as an admin will get those reports. This is just a glance of what Siskit Point can do. My recommendation is that after this webinar, you go to our website and just try Siskit Point because we have a 21-day free trial that you can access. Thanks for your attention, and I'll send it back to Vlad and the Q&A session.
Thank you so much, Carlo, for the excellent presentation. Now, let's go into questions. So, Thomas, the first one is for you. You remember the terms of use doc you shared towards the beginning of the demo. is that a generic one that Microsoft provides, or are there samples that people can use? I know some people saw it and kind of want to use it as well.
Yes, I'm not aware of any samples, although they can probably found. What I did is I used Copilot in Word, and I asked it, can you please create me a Microsoft 365 guest users terms and conditions, and it created one for me. So I can send it your way, but I'm not sure if it's legally okay. So that's what I did, but I'm sure you can find terms and conditions or terms of use for guest users somewhere. I know, for example, Microsoft has one. If you're a guest user there, so many organizations have one, and I haven't looked at it, but I'm pretty sure you can find a few good ones somewhere. But I used Copilot.
Starting to replace lawyers since 2024.
Yeah.
But okay, so to answer the question, Godwin in the Q&A, so maybe check with your legal team, your security team. They probably have one done by real lawyers, but for a proof of concept, ask Copilot or your favorite generative AI tool to make one for you. Okay, now question again for you, Thomas. Are there any additional steps or configurations needed to allow end users to invite external users to a specific SharePoint site for external collaboration? Does the external ID need to be created first before trying to invite to the SharePoint site?
Yeah, that depends a little bit on the SharePoint configuration. So there is a possibility to, if you're sharing something from SharePoint or OneDrive or Teams, it's all the same basically. If you're sharing a resource from there, there is a configuration setting that you can change to automatically have those entries created. So I go to my OneDrive, I share a document with Vlad, I give Vlad's email address, and Vlad will automatically get an Entra ID registration and invitation. That can happen automatically. That's one of the configuration settings. The other way is that you don't allow that and that you need someone or a process to have those identities created beforehand. And then you can choose Vlad from the people picker, I would still call it. But the identity has to be there. So that's a configuration setting. So, or you provision them manually beforehand or to another, I don't know, provision process. So you have those identities, or you can do it on the fly while you are inviting that person. So those are the two most common options.
Awesome. Okay, a few more questions. So can I make a guest user automatically expire based on inactivity or the end date of a project using out-of-the-box tools, Thomas?
Yes and no. No, if you just have a regular subscription, but there is an add-on that you can buy. Unfortunately, that's how it works these days. There is a governance add-on that you can buy that unlocks those kind of functionalities. So expiration is in there, and also, for example, I always forget how it's called. That you have like access reviews for guests, and you have access reviews for groups. They are included if you have an E3 or E5. But for guests, you need to buy that special governance add-on. Unfortunately, it is what it is. So if you want to unlock all the more interesting lifecycle capabilities with guests, you probably will need to go to that add-on. That's the new way. The new way.
Everything is an extra per user per month. And Carlo, with Siskit Point, that can be done as well, setting an guest user to automatically expire, correct?
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I see that we are right at time. So Thomas, thanks you again for the amazing presentation. And thank you for everyone that attended today from all over the world. Really, we hope you enjoyed. Thank you for the amazing questions. And Thomas, before we wrap things up, any final wisdom you would like to share as people go implement everything that you taught us today?
Yes, I would say if you're a Microsoft 365 administrator, oftentimes, well, we know that Entra ID exists, of course, but I think one of the most important skills as a Microsoft 365 admin is to get to know Entra ID, the security concepts there, conditional access. Maybe you don't have access to them to change them in your tenant, but you know what they do, stuff like that. So Entra ID is your friend, and get to know it better.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And for everybody that enjoyed Carlos' presentation, which I know is everybody, make sure you try SysKit in your own tenant. There's no better way to test it than to just get a 21-day free trial, connect it to your tenant, try things out. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. And we're going to love to show you how you can save time and money with SysKit. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today, and see you on the next webinar.
Bye-bye.